Welcome to the Fibromyalgia Podcast. I'm your coach, Tami Stackelhouse, and this is episode 122. In today's episode, I've invited Ruschelle Khanna, licensed clinical social worker and executive coach, to share her expertise on generational trauma. In previous episodes, we've talked about the way traumatic events you've experienced are impacting your health and your fibromyalgia. Today, we go beyond that to talk about how the traumatic events that have happened to your ancestors are impacting your fibromyalgia. Now, I know that sounds a little woo-woo on the surface, but I promise you, as always, we've got some science in today's episode too. We all have family stories. Stories that include beliefs about money, health, work, how we spend our time, and so on. Maybe you have a family story about a great aunt who was sick all the time and used it to get out of family obligations, and now you feel bad about your fibromyalgia. Maybe you watched your grandfather work himself to the point of illness. Maybe going to the doctor was something your family just did not do. Even positive stories can get twisted over time. Maybe your mom was a wonderful caretaker doing all the things, and now you think you have to do that too. Our family stories, they matter. They impact our relationship with our bodies, our health, our money, and even the world around us. The important thing is we can change those stories. Now, let me introduce you to today's guest. Ruschelle Khanna is on a mission to sort the complexities of family and business to foster health and wealth across generations. She works with individuals and families to overcome trauma, resolve conflict, and live happier, more fulfilled lives. Ruschelle specializes in working with couples in all stages of conflict, executives and high-performing individuals seeking stress management and/or peak performance support, family businesses, both in conflict and in the active prevention of conflict, those suffering from financial trauma, or adult children struggling with a failure to launch in ultra-high net worth families, and those navigating life with chronic diseases like Lyme disease and fibromyalgia. Ruschelle is also the author of the upcoming book to be released spring 2024, Creating an Echo Legacy: Overcome Generational Trauma to Build True Wealth. This book will offer practical tools for addressing some of the challenges that can come up when families have patterns of trauma lingering in their interactions. Now, as always, the information that you hear in today's episode is not meant to be considered medical or professional advice, nor is it intended to replace consulting with a qualified physician or mental health provider. In today's episode, Ruschelle shares some resources where you can find a qualified person to help if that's what you need. For those resources mentioned in today's episode, please visit today's show notes page at fibromyalgiapodcast.com/122. As Ruschelle and I talked today, I actually thought of a few more episodes that might be helpful if you're interested in digging in deeper to these topics. Make sure and stay listening after the interview, and I will have those resources for you. Hi, Ruschelle. Welcome. I'm excited to have you here on the podcast.
Thank you, Tami. It is so good to see you today. Yeah.
Awesome. So of course, I just read your official bio, but why don't you tell us a little bit about you and maybe how you got into doing this kind of work?
So I have been a therapist and executive and business coach for over 20 years. And I work with families and executives, but I also have a very special place in my heart for chronic illness and chronic pain because, as you know, we've known each other for quite a while. I had severe and disabling Lyme disease for several years. And during that time, that's how we met. I had to find a way to stay sane because I wasn't capable of working. So I decided to do a summit. And the summit was actually a sneaky summit because it was on fibromyalgia. And I thought it would be an easy way to talk about the overlap between Lyme disease and fibromyalgia and chronic pain. So it was primarily about fibromyalgia, but I also had interviewed people who also specialize in chronic infections. Yeah. So
Yeah, that's awesome. And we are eventually going to cover that here on the podcast too. So if you've got any good people I need to interview on Lyme, because you're right, there is quite an overlap, and there have been a lot of people I know that were diagnosed with chronic Lyme who thought it was fibromyalgia, right? And then
yeah,
just discovered it maybe was that too, but it actually started with an infection. So yeah.
yeah.
But today we're going to talk about generational trauma. So tell us a little bit about how this can impact people's lives. I'm sure you've got client stories, patient stories that you can share.
Yes, well, over the course of my career, I've had so many that I decided to write a book about it. So I'm in the process of writing Create an Eco Legacy, Overcoming Generational Trauma to Build True Wealth. So in that book, I'm kind of tackling generational trauma and how it impacts money specifically, but today we're going to tie that back to fibromyalgia because money is just our currency and our energy. And we know with fibromyalgia, sometimes energy is lacking and
Yeah,
sometimes finances are lacking as
right.
well because of that. So the more I worked with people, the more I realized that there's a classic book about generational trauma called It Didn't Start With You. And I think that title sums up a lot of our issues in our present life. A lot of our issues did not start with us. And that doesn't mean we're not taking responsibility for our lives or blaming our parents and grandparents for everything. But the things that are inherited, whether they be genetic inheritances, and we know that traumas, because the definition of trauma is serious injury caused by an experience. And we know that serious injury of our ancestors is stored in the body and that is passed down to our children. The reason I started writing the book, one of the reasons was because actually, and I tell this in the book, my earliest memory is not my own. My earliest memory is my mother's.
Hmm.
And there's a lot of research now that says that they're really starting to prove that we inherit memories as well and thoughts about things. And I didn't, until I read this study, I didn't put it together that yes, my first memory was my mother's memory, and it was a traumatic memory that had been imprinted on me that I carried. And is it okay if I share that memory?
Yeah, absolutely.
It is a traumatic memory, so I'll warn you before I say it.
Yeah.
It's not a happy memory, but
Yeah.
from the time I was around 3 or 4, which is my earliest memory, I remember looking out the window and envisioning my father deceased in the front yard. And for some reason, linking it to his heart, like that there was a problem with his heart. And I would stay up all night and watch my parents sleep when I was very little. I was very afraid that something was going to happen to my parents. Well, nothing was wrong with my parents. I hadn't even had a relative die at that point. There was no death around me at that age. But when my mother was age 4, her father passed away suddenly from organ failure. And that was, I mean, consciously, that was not a story that was told to me
Sure.
age 0 to 4, right? Like
Right.
that would not have been a
Right.
story. And it really wasn't a history, a family history that was discussed a lot. This wasn't, my mother did not know her father, so there was no reason for her to talk about the death of her father. So the point is, I grew up with a tremendous amount of fear and loss from the time I was very young that I didn't understand and that I was not responsible for and that didn't start with me.
So these are feelings of fear and loss without the actual event, like without the actual loss or without the actual event that would cause you to be afraid, right?
Correct. And if we think about it, I was actually partially present. I was an egg in my mother's body when she experienced that loss.
Right. Yep.
So I guess the first question that I might pose to your audience is, can you stop and think about maybe some things that you might be struggling with that might have to do with something that you know about your family history, a story, an idea of even a lot of times they're periphery stories, like Uncle Joe had a drinking problem. I mean, they can be these things that are on the periphery. They don't have to be directly related. But one of the first places I go with my clients is tell me a little bit about your family stories. And this is also something that's echoed in Mark Wallen's book, It Didn't Start With You, when he does family constellations therapy, which is, I'm not a strict family constellations practitioner, but that is the modality that people use to do generational trauma work.
Yeah. So, this idea then of a trauma happening to your mom, your dad, somewhere up the line in your family, right? And then that trauma being passed on to you, that could be literally in your DNA, right? Because we know some traumas can actually change DNA and then that gets passed on to you. And thoughts, right? Like thinking, you know, people who were growing up or living during the Depression have certain thoughts and ideas about money and saving and how we live, right? That are maybe different than we have now. But you're also talking about something else, right? Like thoughts, memories, feelings that aren't necessarily in your DNA or even talked about.
Well, this idea of actual memories, of an imagery. So that is amazing. And, I have read, in my research, I've read that Native cultures believe that. I haven't found kind of the direct, this has like been talked about in research studies, but I haven't seen exactly the Native studies where they say that, oh, this is common knowledge that we inherit memories and ideas about things. And now there's research being done in the lab with worms, actual worms, I believe is what they're doing. So anyway, it can be how the parenting style as well, right? So the nurture and the nature in the home is both how we get our generational trauma. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And so, how does this affect us physically? Because, this is the Fibromyalgia podcast.
Yeah.
So, how does
So,
that tie in?
well, Tammy, I actually had a client just recently that, I mainly work online now. I'm not a body worker per se. I do somatic and movement and breath work in my sessions, but I'm not touching people. Um, it all has to do with our fascia. And if I can explain what fascia is, if you kind of,
Yeah, please.
so when we are born and we're an embryo, I just love this kind of stuff. When we're born and we're a little embryo, and as we're growing and we're growing and growing, there's this meshy web of proteins that is kind of holding you all together. And as you grow and you get bigger and bigger, that meshy web just expands. And it is the framework of your body. And your body is this unique shape. And proteins are electrical conductors. So you are like a walking antenna that is uniquely shaped, meaning you uniquely receive information in this wonderful way that only you can. And when we have an experience, whether it's an emotional experience or maybe a physical experience, that is, we'll go back to the definition of trauma, a serious injury caused by an experience, the fascia gets, like, it gets these knots in it.
Mm-hmm.
And then the knot creates a positive feedback loop. And positive doesn't mean
It doesn't mean positive.
good. It doesn't always mean good unless there's something good happening there. Positive just means I'm going to reinforce whatever's happening, which could mean a tremendous amount of pain. And so something like myofascial release or even talk therapy can cause a release in the fascia so that the energy flows again and we have health in that area. And so recently I had a client with Lyme disease. There's a lot of occipital pain, so pain at the base of the skull.
Mm-hmm.
And we did an exercise where we did breathing. She needed an image of feeling supported, so she came up with an image of hands holding. So I said, well, why don't we let our hands hold our occipital bone? And then let's do some breathing. And as we breathed, we talked through all the emotions that might be stored in the occipital region. She thought of memories and losses, a lot of losses. And so we talked through the losses and we held her occipital bone with her hands. And then we focused on all the support in her life and all this abundance of support that she does actually have. Because when we have chronic illness, we always feel like we're alone. We're alone in this. This is isolating.
Yeah.
So we redirected back to feeling supported. She took a big breath and her spine popped.
Oh my goodness.
I said, oh my goodness. And tremendous relief. So that's an example of the body really holding. It was holding grief. It was holding loss. It was holding not feeling supported. So, wherever you have pain, I always recommend the person really nurture that part. And Tami, you probably do these exercises. Yeah, I see you nodding your head. So
Yeah. Well,
yeah.
and the other piece of this too, is that fascia is so implicated in fibromyalgia, right? Dr. Ginevra Lipton, she thinks this is where the pain is coming from with fibromyalgia, is our fascia. And so, if we know that this kind of generational trauma itself, these things are kind of stored in our fascia, then of course, like that's our connection then to fibromyalgia and fibromyalgia pain. How does this also tie in? Like, a lot of people are talking about the book, The Body Keeps the Score.
Yes.
But that is a little bit different than what we're talking about here, isn't it?
Well, it is directly related to what I just described in terms of working with that client. That's exactly, we were looking for where the body was storing the trauma. And the way I connect it to money is that we're talking about your currency. So the word currency, a current is a flow and an exchange of information. Money is just our exchange of goods and services and information. And so if you think of the fascia, so some, well, we have two different things going on. You can think of the fascia as the superhighway of your currency. Like if the highway is not in order, then we've got things get rerouted and get stuck and whole. Remember when all those ships didn't make it here from
Yeah.
China and all the stuff was stuck off the
Yes.
coast of California? Yeah, that's what happens, right? And then money and people lose money and then all chaos ensues. So your fascial work is keeping that system clean, and that can happen through trauma therapy, things like EMDR, DNRS, that sort of thing. And they can also happen through our body work, like the MELT method. Sue Hitzman, who I interviewed for the summit. The other part of it is our muscular system. So the Dr. Alpern, who I interviewed for this summit, he is an Olympic weightlifting coach. So he talked a lot about the muscles being the superhighway for the hormones. So you have the hormonal system that needs to flow correctly, and then you have our electrical system, the energetic system that needs to flow correctly. And if we're talking about currency and money management, it's a metaphor for the same thing. Am I getting enough money in all the time? Am I able to metabolize and use that money correctly? Am I able to turn it into productive energy for the rest of my life? And we know that with fibromyalgia, all of these systems get like, I'm drained, I'm wired, tired and wired 1 minute. Like my energy systems are off as well. And I have had Tami, you may have experience with this too. When people get a fibromyalgia diagnosis or a Lyme diagnosis or a long COVID diagnosis, it seems like their money is falling apart too. Maybe they're in a legal battle or their business is falling apart. Friends are betraying them. I mean, it's like this spiral of how did all this stuff happen at the same time? And it wasn't just because you got sick. That
Right.
there's no way I got a betrayal and then I also couldn't get out of bed. And how are these things related? But I guess part of me would say they are related. And we're talking about energy.
Right. Yeah. When I was diagnosed, I had it's a whole nother story for a whole nother podcast, but I had left my job in like July, and I was diagnosed in maybe February, so it wasn't even a whole year afterwards. And during that time, my husband and I were fairly newly married. We had gotten married in May. Before that July. And, we had kind of kept living like we had two incomes when we only had one, and the things that happen like that, either physically, monetarily, relationship wise, they take time to develop. Right. And so these things are kind of happening at the same time, whether that's the same source, whether there's a lot of ways we could look at that. Maybe I'm getting tense because of the money situation. Maybe the money situation is happening because I'm getting sick. Who knows?
Yeah. So where do we start sorting it all out? Yeah. And the book, now there are many places where we could start. So I want to preface what I'm saying with, you can start anywhere as long as you start observing your life. You can start with your health or a craft project or wherever you want. But the book is about starting with rebuilding our family and a lot of young adults that I work with are in strained relationships with their parents. And sometimes money is involved in those conversations. And the young adults are sick. And a lot of that has come from childhood experience. We know because of the ACEs score, right? If you're a chronically ill adult, you may have had these traumas in your childhood.
For people who don't know,
So,
ACEs is adverse childhood experiences.
yes,
Yep.
adverse childhood experiences scale. And the higher your score on that scale, the more likely you are to have a chronic illness as an adult. And these are things like abuse in the home, things that would be hard on kids.
Right. Instability, financial,
Instability,
and
moving,
yeah,
right.
yeah.
Yeah. So the book is about if there is a conflict in your family is a system as well too. Your body's a system, your finances are a system, your family is a system, and they're all repeating the same story. They all have the same narrative. I dislike my mother. I dislike my boss because she reminds me of my mother. They're echoes. That's why I call the book Creating an Echo Legacy. We want our echo to be uh, a one that we want to hear, that we would want to pick up if we were
Right.
in the future.
Yeah.
Um, so the purpose of the book is just to have families talking again about things that they might think are hard. I really want families to know they can talk about hard things. And the reason, Tami, why I wanted to bring this to you was because I have the physical healing that I've seen in people when their families will show up to a meeting is just tremendous. And if your family's not willing to show up for a meeting, you can do it by yourself.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
That is one of the things that I hear so often. What do I do if my family's not supportive? What do I do if people aren't willing to help me? And that's, whether that is an echo of an earlier thing, or that's the maybe even the start of a new echo, right?
Mm-hmm.
How do we work through that and still live the lives that we want to live, even if our families aren't supportive?
Well, um, I guess the word balance is the first thing that comes to mind. In your emotional work, it would be a balance of letting go of the grief, allowing yourself to grieve, and then holding on to the things that maybe your family could show up for you for.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I mean, Tami, you're talking to somebody, my family completely not out of intentional neglect, but they were paralyzed. They did nothing for me when I was sick. They didn't even come visit me. They did nothing.
Yeah.
And I love my family, and there was an opportunity to really resent them and maybe not have a relationship with them for the rest of my life because my husband and I were completely abandoned. And however, there are many other ways that my family and I can connect, and we did. And it's okay. Now, not everybody can say that for their family. Not everybody wants to. Some people have really supportive families who did lots for them. But just like I did with that woman, you want to acknowledge the grief, but please focus somewhere else where your life is supported. Maybe you have really good friends. Maybe you need to cultivate that. But somewhere life is willing to support you. Somewhere, even if it's a Louise Hay video on YouTube, somewhere life is willing to support you.
Yep. Yep.
Yeah.
And I think sometimes too, we have to, like you said, the word cultivate. I think that's perfect, because maybe we don't have the family or the friends or the support that we wish that we had, but we can go out and we can cultivate that and find that. We can make our own family, right?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. I know lots of people who've made their own families. Um, I and I also know lots of people who thought that maybe they couldn't have some reconciliation with their family, and they did. And even if people aren't alive anymore, we can still, these are the stories that we're telling in our head and that we're carrying long after people are gone. And it's your imagination. So you get to change the story.
How powerful is that?
Yeah. I always say use your imagination for good, not for evil. So if you're scaring yourself or torturing yourself or replaying a memory that mom did something horrendous, stop it.
Or that worry of what might happen or could
Or
happen.
the other side, right? The
Yeah.
future imaginings. Yeah.
So, for the person listening who is thinking, okay, this all sounds great, but how do I actually do that? Why don't we get into some practicalities and maybe some steps people can take to explore this more, or maybe even start to change things?
So we can talk about some of the, let's start with some of the physical stuff first. So this example that I gave of basically talking to your body, right? Hey, occipital lobe region, what is going on? So when I ask clients to talk to their body, and there's a whole modality called body talk where all they do is just talk to their body. Um, there's so much in there. And when you first get started with it, you're like, it's not saying anything. It's not saying anything. Well, okay, just keep listening. So, we can do body scans. What do my shoulders say? What does my heart say? What are my feet thinking right now? We think that these parts of our body don't think, but every year they come up with a new thing that says there's neurons in your heart, in your kidneys. There's neurons probably everywhere, but I'm not a scientist. I'm not gonna.
Right.
But your feet do as much thinking as the rest of your body does.
Mm-hmm.
Your feet have 33 bones and thinks all day because it has to balance you all day long. It's thinking.
Mm-hmm. And
So
we do
check
talk
in.
about like, my feet are mad at me today, right? Right? So we pick
Yeah,
up
my back is
on the
killing me.
negative,
Yeah.
but they
Yeah,
talk to
right,
us other times too,
right,
not just when they're screaming and mad.
right, right. So the one of the Buddhist meditation practices is which part of the body is feeling good, right? Or is at peace? What is that part that you don't hear? Because if it's not screaming, it's probably okay. Right? So my chest is open and at ease right now, or I'm feeling relaxed in my eyes. So somewhere has some peace. So you can go between noticing the pain and also appreciating the peace. And then you can take a big inhale and expand that good feeling out to the rest of your body. So visualizing and taking the good energy and putting it somewhere else. Um, Things like tapping. I love tapping with Brad on YouTube. I'm going to give a shout out to Tapping with Brad. He doesn't know me. It doesn't matter. I refer people to his channel all the time because he has great sweaters and he has great tapping scripts. So what's not to love about Tapping with Brad?
Yep.
Have you ever used him? Have you ever seen?
No, no.
Okay, well,
I'll have to
tapping
check that out.
He's good for pain, for confidence, for self-esteem, for anxiety, for just anything any body sensation that's coming up. Tapping is a powerful distraction and focus at the same time.
Mm-hmm.
And the claims are that it's on your acupressure points and it's
Mm-hmm.
stimulating your acupressure points. Yeah. So those are the physical things. The generational trauma things, I would suggest you make a list of all the stories you know about your family. That's the first thing that I would do. Just mom told me this about this, or this is what they always used to say about money. This is what grandma always used to say about the town. Just write down all of the family stories that you know that were told over and over again, good and not so good. And maybe have a therapist or even a friend or maybe have somebody else take a look and look at themes in those stories. What was in there, because this family generational work is all about tracing the narrative.
Mm-hmm.
So there's a narrative that there's never enough is a
Yep.
big one for chronic illness. There's never enough. There's never enough. So with fibromyalgia, with eating disorders, right? With lack is a real theme.
Mm-hmm. Another one is the you're lazy, right?
Yeah, yeah,
That's another big one we see.
yeah.
And
All
a tip for you guys listening, if you write those things on sticky notes, you can move them around and group them.
Yes.
I did that with a client. We were doing something different, but she wrote them on sticky notes because then we could like move them around and like build a timeline or group patterns, right? Like the topics, the subjects like you're talking about here.
Yes, we're looking for patterns.
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. So dig into the stories a little bit. And I guess advanced would be, don't be afraid to rewrite them when they don't suit you. And people really scoff when I say that. Like, but memories are changing all the time. As as I tell a story about my past, it has shifted for me. At the beginning of this podcast, I shared a memory. My earliest memory was not my own. Every time I tell that story, it changes slightly because I'm experiencing it all over again. So now some of the other work that I do is go back in and have people re-experience memories, and then we create something different, right? Like maybe in that memory I would create a beautiful higher being than who was with me by the window and telling me that's not real, that's not your dad. Look at him, or look at him, he's getting up and he's okay. Well, I've recreated the memory now just by a change of a storyline.
Mm-hmm. And memories, like you said, are changing all the time anyway. I was just reading a completely unrelated book, but they talked about a study that was done at a college. They had students write down where they were when they heard the news about the towers falling on 9/11.
Mm.
And then 3 years later, when those students were seniors, they did this when they were
Awesome.
freshmen, they gave those notes back to the students and they were like, this is my handwriting, but that's not what happened. Because
I
their
believe
memory
that.
of the situation had changed completely.
Great study.
Yeah.
Yeah, great.
So, if that is going to happen naturally, why not do that on purpose? Right? And I'm sure too that the parts of the stories that we dwell on grow because that's just how things work, right? What you focus on grows. So if we're focusing on the negative that happened versus maybe, either recreating the memory, like you said, or even focusing on maybe a moment of kindness in the middle of that. Maybe you didn't get what you needed over here, but this other thing also happened.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. That you maybe had forgotten. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely.
Awesome. And when is it helpful for somebody to get maybe professional help with some of this? Because some of this can be really hard.
Well, if after you write out your memories and you're like, holy goodness, I am just replaying some stories here. Um, I would say definitely I love family constellations. Find a family constellation therapist. Hypnosis is wonderful for this because it helps us gently go back and play around with memories and time and things like that. Um, and also, if you're just curious, you can get a genealogist who is also, I know wonderful genealogists who are also very kind and gentle, and doing your genealogy can be a therapeutic experience as well.
Right. Seeing where things come from, I imagine, right?
Yeah. So I would say if you have any interest in it, reach out and start talking to somebody immediately. Because we want to hold on to those patterns that you are proud of from your family, and we want to just let's stop the ones that need to be let go.
Right. Right. And obviously, you guys, this podcast episode is meant to sort of introduce you to these ideas. It's not meant to be all the therapy you will ever do on this. Yeah. So if you are looking for help, Ruschelle, where are some good places to look? How would somebody find a genealogist or family constellation therapist or
Yeah. So I'll send you some links. Um,
Perfect. We can put those in
so
today's show notes. Yep.
Yep. There are family constellations, therapists, leagues, that organizations where you can search. I'll send you a great genealogist who does more sort of like therapeutic genealogy. She's not a therapist. She does, counseling around and a place where you express what it is, the information that you've found. And then, of course, if anyone wants to connect with me, I do both therapy and coaching in the US. So, yeah.
And are you able to help people anywhere in the US or just where you live?
So, for coaching, I can help anyone. And if we were doing trauma therapy or, processing trauma, things like that, I am in specific states in the Northeast: New York, New Jersey, Connecticut, Rhode Island, and West Virginia.
Awesome. And for people who might be wondering, what would be the difference between that kind of work, the coaching versus the therapy?
Yep. So coaching is forward focused. So coaching is more for the person who's like, look, I do what mom does. I know what I do. I do what mom does, and I don't want to do it anymore. Can we do something else? That's coaching. And then the trauma work is more looking back into the past and is more about really digging in and processing those memories. And that is great to do in person. You can do it online. It's great to do in conjunction with body work when you're doing it, because we are talking about stuff that's in the body, right? So the trauma work is when you feel like, boy, I am stuck in a big way and I'm in a lot of pain and I don't know how to get out of it.
Right. Right.
Yeah.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for this, for sharing your stuff. And if people are interested in your book that is still in process, what's the best way to stay in touch with you? Do you have a list people can get on to be notified when the book is done?
So they can go to my website, RuschelleKhanna.com, and they can sign up for my newsletter. And I have a page about the book on the website. And of course, you can just email me if you have questions as well.
Awesome. Awesome. Well, thank you so much again. And just to wrap up, thinking about the person who's out there listening that maybe this is resonating with, what would you say to that person, just from your heart to theirs?
I would say just start writing some of your thoughts about this down and don't be afraid to connect with your ancestors. That may be for a whole other episode.
Right.
But the point of the book and the point of me coming on the show is that you can talk about hard things.
Yeah.
And you can do that with a professional or with your family. And if you want you and your family to do it with support, you can. So, yeah.
Awesome. Awesome. And this can be the doorway to, you know, a better, happier, more fulfilled, less pain filled life, really.
Yes. Yes. Tremendous healing can happen by looking at our stories.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, thank you again, Ruschelle. And everybody, if you just want to hang on a little bit longer, we've got our listener shout out, and I've got a few more resources for you. As I mentioned earlier, my conversation with Ruschelle brought to mind several other episodes that may be helpful if you're looking to go deeper on these topics. First is episode 65, EFT for Fibromyalgia with Lauren Fonville. This is a great resource to learn more about the tapping Ruschelle mentioned in this episode. In episode 65, Lauren explains what EFT, the emotional freedom technique, or tapping, is. She talks about how it works and even leads us through a tap-along session at the end of the interview. The focus of episode 65 is more on using EFT for fibromyalgia pain, but it will still give you a great overview of the modality. Episode 81, Befriend Your Nervous System with Sarah Kleiner, goes into more detail on somatic experiencing and somatic work. You will have heard Ruschelle mention somatic work during our interview today. There are also 2 episodes with Dr. Robin Pfaff discussing trauma, post-traumatic stress, and post-traumatic growth. You'll find these at episode 23 and episode 41. Last, since so much of our generational trauma is accompanied by grief, I also want to recommend episode 94, Grief and Fibromyalgia with Pat Shevland. We will have all of these episodes listed on today's show notes page. Of course, you can also just search your favorite podcast app, but if you'd like to see them listed out so you can just click on them, go to fibromyalgiapodcast.com/122 and they will all be listed. Now I've got this week's listener shout out for you. I just ran across this email from a couple years ago and thought it would be fun to share it again. This is from Diane in Arizona, and she wrote to me about episode 73, When Everything Goes Wrong. In that episode, I shared about my stress and struggles with a very sick 4-legged child, my cat Sam, and I also shared some of the things that I was doing in that moment to manage my stress when everything goes wrong. This is what Diane said. She says, "This recent podcast, episode 73, was wonderful. As usual, you hit it out of the park. By being so generously open about your challenges and struggles, you are helping people in a holistic and demonstrative way. There's no substitute for this helpful, particular guidance." Thank you so much again, Diane. You know, we all go through hard things. Maybe yours isn't a sick cat. Maybe it's job stress, relationship stress, money stress, moving. As we discussed in episode 118 about adrenal dysfunction, stress takes a toll on our bodies. And learning how to manage stress when everything goes wrong is something that we all need. So, if you need some help in learning how to manage your stress, or if you just want some support while you're going through those stressful events, consider scheduling a consultation with a certified fibromyalgia coach. To be completely honest, I could not have gotten through that couple of months with a very sick cat without the help of several people, including my coach and my coaching family, the coaches that I have trained and work with. They all keep me sane. They helped me keep my head above water, reminding me what was most important and reminding me of the things I could let go of. Several of them even stepped up and took over a couple of tasks that I just honestly could not do. If you are looking for that kind of support, if you're looking for that kind of help, I would highly suggest scheduling a consultation with a certified fibromyalgia coach. Not only do we understand what it's like to go through that kind of stress, we also understand what it's like to have that kind of stress and live in a fibro body. Because let's face it, stress like that makes our fibro symptoms worse, which makes our brain fog worse, which makes our fatigue worse, which makes it even more difficult to do the things we need to do. So talk with somebody who understands and gets you. If you would like to schedule a consultation with a coach or a student who is trained by me, go to findafibrocoach.com. We've got everything from free scholarship consultations to sessions with students to fully certified fibromyalgia coaches. And every now and then, you may also find an opportunity to meet directly with me. Again, that's findafibrocoach.com. See you back here next time.